just some final thoughts on this Chris Eubank Jr. Liam Williams fight. Now, I rewatched, well, I didn't watch the whole fight, but I just rewatched some highlights of the Demetrius Andrade Liam Williams fight. I saw the whole fight at the time, but yesterday, I think it was, I rewatched some highlights. And Liam Williams, of course, gets dropped in the second round by a Demetrius Andrade left hand, which is suggestive of him being vulnerable to getting stopped by Chris Eubank Jr. Demetrius Andrade is not a massive puncher, but he has decent power. I would say Andrade and Eubank, is their power comparable? Maybe. See, the thing about Andrade is I don't think he's extremely heavy-handed, but he's very fast and he's very unorthodox and he's more rangy than Eubank Jr. So his punches seem to come out of the blue more and surprise opponents more. I don't think opponents are as surprised as often by Eubank Jr.'s punches. So, and the reason I mention that is because the element of surprise is very important if you want to be able to drop or even stop your opponent. It's the shots that your opponent doesn't see that tend to hurt them more. So when I'm comparing the power of Eubank Jr. and Andrade, I'm not sure who to give it to or whether they have a similar level of punching power. But either way, I think Eubank Jr. will have the power to hurt Liam Williams, particularly because Eubank Jr. puts his shots together. And if you cast your minds back to the Spike O'Sullivan fight, for example, he overwhelmed O'Sullivan. I don't think he dropped him, did he? But he overwhelmed him. He threw so many shots and he hit him with every punch in the book, uppercuts, hooks, straight shots, jabs, everything. And in the end, O'Sullivan couldn't take it. And I believe his corner pulled him out or O'Sullivan quit on the stool. So I could potentially see Eubank Jr. getting Liam Williams into a scenario like that. But at the same time, I do think that Liam Williams has the power to drop Chris Eubank Jr. for the first time. If Eubank Jr. is going in there thinking Liam Williams can't hurt him, doesn't have the power to knock him out, I suspect he might be in for a surprise. Because Liam Williams hurts a lot of people. He certainly hurt Demetrius Andrade. And while Chris Eubank Jr. appears to have a good chin, I'm not so sure. I'm not necessarily convinced that he's got as good a chin as his dad. Because his dad, I would say his dad's chin was tested more often by serious punches than Chris Eubank's chin has been tested. Obviously, he's been in there with the likes of George Groves, who is a bigger guy and punches very hard. But how many times did Groves really land that big right hand? I don't recall Groves landing a right hand on Eubank Jr. that was anything like the right hands he landed on Carl Froch in their first fight. Yeah, maybe I'm forgetting, but I don't recall anything like that happening. What I do remember is that Chris Eubank Jr. was hurt and had his knees buckled by a George Groves jab. And that was relatively early in the fight. Also, Eubank Jr. fought Spike O'Sullivan, who's, I guess, a good puncher, but at what level? And does Spike O'Sullivan hit harder than Liam Williams? I suspect not. Who else has Eubank Jr. been in with that can punch? Arthur Abraham? But again, Arthur Abraham never really caught him with anything. Could Arthur Abraham hit harder than Liam Williams? Perhaps. But again, if you're not able to catch the guy, and at that stage, Arthur Abraham was just there to make up the numbers, let's be real. Liam Williams is not there to make up the numbers. Liam Williams will be in front of his hometown fans, and he's coming to win. He's a naturally aggressive guy. He's still ambitious. He wants to do damage. And I think if Eubank Jr. is if Eubank Jr. is not careful, he could wind up getting himself hurt in this fight, perhaps more seriously than he's ever been hurt before in a professional boxing ring. So I think he's got to be a lot more careful than perhaps he thinks he does. With that being said, Liam Williams revealed that Eubank Jr. has put a rematch clause in the contract, which seems to be suggestive of someone who isn't quite as certain of victory as he would have us believe. Because you listen to Eubank Jr. and you think that he thinks it's going to be a blowout, an easy fight. Well, if it's going to be that easy, why would there be a rematch clause in the contract? You guys let me know what you think in the comments below. So yeah, I think it's a fascinating fight. I think that in the early rounds, as Liam Williams said, by the way, in an interview, and he could be trying to mislead, trying to just muddy the waters by saying that he thinks the fight could start cagey. But that's what he said to Sky, that he expects it to be cagey in the first couple rounds. But then as soon as the first big shot lands from either guy, it will start to heat up and potentially turn into a war. I can actually see something like that happening, because even when I looked at Liam Williams on the pads, Williams looked to be working more on his jab and his boxing rather than just the relentless front foot pressure stuff. So I think he's going to try and be technical early on and see how well that works. And if that doesn't work well and Eubank Jr. is able to get the better of the long range boxing, I think then he'll revert back to type, as it were, and start pressuring Eubank Jr. and trying to win the fight that way. So it's going to be an interesting, I think, first couple rounds to see who gets the better of the long range stuff. And then after that, you know, let's say Liam Williams is doing well at long range, Eubank Jr. is then going to have to take a chance, start applying pressure and trading and what have you. Or perhaps it'll be the other way around. We'll see. Now, the thing about Liam Williams is he's got quite narrow shoulders and relatively short arms. Eubank Jr. is not the broadest shouldered guy in the world either. He doesn't have shoulders like his dad. His dad was much broader in the shoulders than Eubank Jr. And the reason I say this is because that matters when it comes to exchanging hooks. The guy who's a bit more narrow, whose arms are a bit shorter, at close range, his hooks can get there in between the guy with the broader shoulders and the longer arms hooks. Liam Williams might have shorter hooks than Eubank Jr. Eubank Jr. does throw them quite wide sometimes. He can throw them short, particularly the uppercuts. But sometimes when he puts his head down and starts cranking hooks, they can be quite wide and wild at times. And in an exchange like that, I think he's in danger of getting caught by Liam Williams with a shorter, more compact shot. So, yeah, I'm anticipating a good fight. Could Liam Williams get stopped early? Maybe. You know, Eubank Jr. overwhelms him, catches him the way Andrade was able to catch him a bit cold early on. So I wouldn't I wouldn't completely dismiss that scenario. But at the same time, I wouldn't dismiss Liam Williams winning either. I think it's a really intriguing fight. Again, a fight which, if I had to pick a winner, I would lean towards Eubank Jr., but not by much, to be honest with you. Not by much. I could see Liam Williams winning the fight as well. So anyway, you guys let me know what you think in the comments below. Who have you got winning? Do you, like me, believe Liam Williams does have the power to hurt Chris Eubank Jr., potentially stop him? Or do you think that this is actually going to go pretty much the way Eubank Jr. says it will, which will be, you know, a one-sided beatdown where he's going to do to Liam Williams what he did to, let's say, Nick Blackwell, or what's the other guy called? Mr. Robot, the Turkish guy who absolutely bricked it against Canelo. What's his name? I forget the guy's name now. Oh, it's lost. It's gone out my memory. He also knocked out, apparently, James DeGale's teeth in sparring. What is his name? Why have I forgotten the name of it? Maybe it's best if I forget the name of the guy, because he hasn't been very impressive, has he? Also fought Darrell. Completely forgot the guy's name. So, yeah, anyway, leave your thoughts in the comment section below. Let me know what you think about this fight.